By the time Caleb Hart realized the overpass was about to give way, the first commuter bus was already climbing the ramp. He stood in the middle of the access lane, reflective vest, glowing in the pre-dawn dark, waving his arms like a madman, while horns blared and brakes screamed. Chunks of concrete were starting to shear off the underside of the bridge. He could hear the steel groan, a sound he'd only heard once before in his life, right before another structure failed and took his wife with it. The city's traffic control radios were full of static and excuses. Someone had locked out his access. Someone wanted this to look like an accident. But Caleb wasn't about to watch 50 strangers die because some politician or contractor decided corners were cheaper than lives. He stepped in front of the bus, palms out, ready to get flattened if that's what it took. Behind the windshield, he could see the driver's eyes go wide. And in the second row, clutching a briefcase to her chest, the deputy mayor who had begged him just hours earlier not to get involved stared at him like she finally understood who he really was. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from tonight. And hit that like and subscribe button if you believe courage still matters in this world. Caleb Hart was 37, and according to his ID badge, he was just night shift tech number 214 at the Lakeside Transit Depot in Cleveland, Ohio. Most people thought that meant he changed oil and swept out empty buses until the sun came up. They didn't see the way he checked every weld with a flashlight like a surgeon studying an X-ray. They didn't see the way his eyes always drifted instinctively to load-bearing beams, stress cracks, and the places where metal met rust. During the day, he was just dad to 11-year-old Mason, who thought his father fixed buses and made the best grilled cheese in Cuyahoga County. Their little rented duplex was cluttered with Lego helicopters and math homework, the walls taped with drawings of bridges and football fields, and a dog they couldn't afford yet. Most evenings, Caleb would sit at the kitchen table checking over Mason's school forms, then pull on his dark work jacket and kiss his son's head before heading into the cold. He told Mason that working nights meant you got to watch the sunrise on the company's dime. He did not say that working nights meant fewer crowds, fewer questions, and fewer chances for anyone to connect Caleb Hart, bus mechanic, with the former structural rescue specialist who'd once hung from helicopters over collapsed buildings. Since the overpass disaster 5 years ago, the one that killed his wife Lena, and 32 others, Caleb had sworn off heroics. The official report called it an unforeseen failure. Caleb called it what it was: negligence and pressure to reopen a road too soon. He'd screamed about hairline fractures and incomplete curing times, and no one listened until the bridge folded under morning traffic and his wife's car went down with it. After that, he walked away from federal rescue teams, away from hearings and TV cameras, and into a job where nothing more was supposed to be at stake than an engine light and a missed route. He kept his head down. He did his work. He made sure every bus that rolled out of his bay was a little safer than the city strictly required. And for a while, that felt like enough. Until the night the deputy mayor showed up at the depot in tennis shoes and an oversized hoodie, eyes red, clutching a manila folder to her chest like it was a life raft. Her name was Dana Whitlock, the youngest deputy mayor the city had ever had, and she was supposed to be home in a lakeside condo, not shaking in the shadows of Bay 6 at 2 in the morning. "Mr. Hart," she said, voice low and flat like it had taken everything to come here. "You don't know me, but I've seen your file. And if what's in this folder is real, then tomorrow morning people are going to die on our buses." Caleb didn't answer right away. Dana Whitlock stood stiff and pale under the depot's buzzing lights, the manila folder trembling in her hands. She looked like someone who had run out of allies and wasn't sure she deserved a new one. He motioned her into his workstation, closed the metal door behind them, and listened as she laid out blueprints, inspection logs, and a schedule that didn't make sense unless someone wanted it that way. By the time she finished, his chest felt like someone had tightened a strap around it. But Part 1 had ended with that folder. Part 2 began with the consequences. The morning after their meeting, Caleb clocked out from the night shift and walked Mason to school. The air was cold and crisp, one of those Ohio mornings when you could see your breath, even after the sun had been up for an hour. Mason talked about a science fair and a shoebox diorama he needed to build. Caleb nodded, but his mind was back in Bay 6 replaying the hairline cracks Dana had circled in red, the missing weld reports, the oversight forms that had been rubber-stamped so many times the ink looked tired. Dad Mason tugged on his sleeve. "You're squeezing my hand too hard." He loosened his grip immediately. "Sorry, buddy." Long night. Mason didn't press. He'd grown used to his father's quiet spells, the ones that came when old memories flickered like static. But today felt different, heavier somehow. When Caleb got back to the depot later that evening, the place had a strange charge in the air. Conversations stopped when he walked by. A few techs traded looks. One supervisor, Ken Myers, a man who strutted like the title on his badge, gave him a higher tax bracket, waited for Caleb by his workstation. Office. Now. Caleb followed him into a small room that smelled like reheated coffee and stale authority. Ken shut the door behind them. "You want to tell me what's going on with you?" Caleb raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean I've heard your name in meetings all day? You were seen talking to the deputy mayor." Ken leaned back like he was preparing to deliver a sermon. "You're a night shift mechanic, Hart. You're not cleared to talk to elected officials about infrastructure inspections or anything else. You know the chain of command." Caleb kept his voice even. "She asked me a question. I answered. That's not your job. And it's not a good look." Ken folded his arms. "You stay in your lane, understood? We can't have techs wandering around playing whistleblower." It was meant to humiliate him. Ken had done it before small cuts, delivered with a smile, always eager to remind people how replaceable they were. But today felt different. Today, it wasn't just the insult. Today, the insult had teeth. Caleb nodded once. "Am I being written up for something?" Ken smirked. "Not yet. But you keep sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, and you're going to find out how fast this department can make problems disappear." Caleb left the office without responding. Silence was safer. Silence didn't make enemies. Silence didn't make promises he might have to keep. But it still burned. The pressure got worse over the next 2 nights. First came the sudden shift changes. He showed up for his normal 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. slot, only to be told he'd been reassigned to 2 a.m. to 10 a.m. with no explanation. Then came the parts inventory audit, conveniently scheduled right after his bay was mysteriously left in disarray, like someone wanted it to look like he'd failed an inspection. Even the way people looked at him changed. The nods and small greetings he used to get from fellow techs evaporated. He became someone they avoided eye contact with. Someone marked. And through all of it, the folder in his locker sat like a weight he couldn't ignore. The only bright spot was Mason, until even that started to crack. One evening when Caleb picked him up from school, Mason climbed into the truck unusually quiet. No chatter about homework. No jokes about the kid who always traded snacks. He looked down at his shoes, twisting the laces around his fingers. "Dad," he said finally, "are you in trouble?" Caleb felt something drop in his stomach. "Why would you think that?" Some kids said their parents saw you arguing with police. They said you're gonna lose your job. "Is that true?" Caleb's jaw tightened. He kept his voice gentle. "No, buddy, I'm not in trouble. Adults talk, kids repeat stuff. It doesn't mean it's true. Mason nodded, but didn't look convinced, and that hurt worse than anything Ken had thrown at him. That night after Mason was asleep, Caleb stared at the ceiling for hours. He'd spent years building a quiet life, brick by brick. A life where his son was safe, routines were predictable, and no one expected him to rescue anyone ever again. But now the seams of that life were splitting open. He remembered Dana Whitlock's shaking hands the night she brought the folder. He remembered her saying, "If this is real, people are going to die." He remembered Lena's face the morning she left for work, and the bridge that didn't hold. He closed his eyes. He'd tried running from who he used to be, but maybe who he used to be was the only one who could stop what was coming. By the third night, the pressure cooker finally clicked into place. Caleb arrived at the depot to find his access badge denied at the main gate. The guard new guy, maybe mid-20s, shrugged, like he didn't know anything, only that Caleb's name was flagged, pending review by administration. He was still arguing politely with the guard when a black SUV pulled up. Two men in city jackets stepped out. And Ken, grinning like Christmas morning had come early. "Mr. Hart," one of the city officials, said, "We need to ask you a few questions about irregularities in your maintenance reports." Caleb frowned. "What irregularities?" Ken stepped forward. "Don't play innocent. We have timestamps, failed inspections, and we've been informed you've been contacting city leadership directly without approval." The words were delivered loudly, deliberately loud enough for every tech in line for the night shift to hear. They stared like he was contagious, like his downfall might splatter onto them. Caleb felt heat rise in his chest. The humiliation was sharp and mean, but the fear was quieter, deeper. If they pushed this far, they might push further. They might go after his job, his license, his custody. He imagined Mason waking up to an empty house. He imagined social workers, courtrooms, accusations he couldn't outrun. He swallowed hard. What exactly am I being accused of? The city official opened a folder too quickly, like a performance. "We've found evidence suggesting you altered inspection notes for 2 buses scheduled for the downtown route tomorrow morning, routes that carry over 1,000 commuters." Caleb blinked. He would never falsify an inspection. Not for anyone. Not even for himself. But the pages in the official's hands bore his digital signature, his ID code, his timestamp. It was a flawless trap. Ken leaned in, voice low enough only Caleb could hear. "You should have stayed in your lane." Something inside Caleb, something he'd kept buried, shifted. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was the cold, razor-sharp clarity of a man who had spent years studying failure points, who knew when a structure was nearing collapse. The overpass wasn't the only thing about to break. The city official snapped the folder shut. "Mr. Hart, we're placing you on immediate administrative suspension pending investigation." Behind them, the depot grew quieter. Workers watched, as though someone were being led to a firing squad. Caleb lifted his chin. "I want to speak to Deputy Mayor Whitlock." Ken barked a laugh. "Oh, she won't be taking your calls anymore." But Caleb had seen the fear in Dana's eyes. He knew a bluff when he heard one. Still, as he stood at the gate, with his badge deactivated, and every exit closing around him, a thought hit him hardest of all. If they're willing to frame me, what are they willing to do to keep Mason quiet? And that was the breaking point. The moment the pressure stopped building and started cracking. Because now the danger wasn't just structural or political. Now it was personal. And Caleb Hart, quiet, careful, grief-scarred, felt something old wake up inside him. Something the city wasn't prepared for. Caleb stood in the cold outside the depot gate long after the SUV pulled away. Frost gathered on the chain-link fence, catching the light from the street lamps in dull amber flecks. His badge, dead useless, hung from his hand like a verdict. He could have gone home, crawled into bed, pretended this nightmare would magically resolve itself by morning. But the look on Mason's face earlier that week wouldn't leave him. A scared kid asking if his dad was in trouble. A question no child should ever have to ask. That memory pushed him into motion. He walked to his truck, sat behind the wheel, and didn't start the engine. Instead, he pulled out his phone and opened the photos folder. He scrolled past birthdays, fishing trips, and science projects until he found the last picture of Lena standing on a bridge that no longer existed, sunlight in her hair. She'd teased him for inspecting the guardrails during their walk, asked him whether he'd ever be able to stop worrying about structural failures. He'd answered, "Not as long as I care about who's standing on them." He closed the photo. The city had spent years pretending that collapse had been unforeseeable, but he knew better. He wasn't about to let it happen again. He started the truck and headed toward City Hall. By the time he reached downtown, the sky had darkened into a low, bruised blue. The morning commute was only hours away, and somewhere in the municipal maze of offices' schedules were already finalized routes printed and equipment cleared for service, including the 2 buses whose falsified inspection records now had his name on them. He parked in a loading zone and moved quickly toward the service entrance Dana had mentioned during their brief, frantic call earlier that night. She'd whispered, "I can only buy you a few minutes," before hanging up like someone had just walked into her office. Now, as he entered the building, he felt it danger pressing close, thick as humidity before a storm. Inside the deputy mayor's floor was mostly dark, lit only by the glow of emergency fixtures and the faint hum of vending machines down the hall. But a light was on at the far end. A door cracked open. A shadow moved. Caleb slowed his steps. He heard voices. One of them was Dana's. "I didn't tell anyone," she said, her voice shaking. "I only asked for clarification." "You said the oversight numbers didn't match." A man cut her off. "You weren't supposed to look that closely. That's why we use night shift grunts to rubber stamp maintenance. People who won't ask questions." Caleb felt heat rise in his throat. Grunt. Nobody. Disposable. He edged toward the crack in the door. Inside, Dana stood against a filing cabinet, her hair disheveled like she'd backed away from someone. A man in a city jacket loomed over her. Bigger. Broader. His stance predatory. And behind him sat a stack of documents, probably the same inspection sheets and route logs she'd shown Caleb. The man lowered his voice. "If you keep asking questions, someone will get hurt. You need to stop." Dana swallowed hard. "I'm not backing down." The man stepped forward. Caleb moved without thinking. He pushed the door open, stepping into the light like he'd been walking through fog, and finally found ground. "Let her go." The man turned, his eyes narrowed. "Well, he said the mechanic shows up. You just don't know when to quit." He wasn't surprised to see Caleb. He wasn't afraid of him either. That was a mistake. Caleb scanned the room in one glance. The man's posture. Dana's position. The nearest objects he could use if things went bad. Instincts he'd buried years ago, flickered back to life with terrible ease. "Step away from her," Caleb said, voice low and even. "You really want to get involved in this?" the man asked. "You're already suspended. You're done. Walk away." Caleb shook his head once. Not happening. The man reached toward his belt. Not for a weapon, Caleb saw no holster, but for a radio. A call for backup. A signal that things needed to escalate. Caleb didn't let him touch it. He crossed the room fast, closing the distance before the man could react. He knocked the radio aside with a sharp movement and planted his shoulder squarely into the man's center mass. They hit the wall hard. The filing cabinet rattled metal, groaning. Dana gasped and bolted out of the way. The man swung wildly, a hard, desperate arc meant to intimidate or injure. Caleb ducked under it, felt the air of the blow whistle past his ear, and countered with a controlled strike to the man's ribs, angled to knock breath out without breaking anything. The man staggered. Caleb followed. Another hit. Precise, efficient. Not rage, not vengeance, just training skills he'd spent years refusing to acknowledge. The man dropped to one knee. Caleb grabbed his collar and hauled him upright, staring straight into his widening eyes. "You're threatening the wrong people." Then he let go. The man collapsed against the wall, gasping. Dana stood frozen, her hand over her mouth. Caleb turned to her. "We need access to your terminal. Now." She nodded and hurried to her desk, hands shaking as she pulled up the city's internal route system. Windows flickered open, bus assignments, timing charts, structural clearance reports. And there it was. The 2 buses she had flagged, scheduled for the downtown express route at 7:10 a.m. A route that crossed the very structure she believed was compromised. "It's worse than I thought," she whispered. "If these buses go out as scheduled." Caleb finished her sentence quietly. "People won't make it home." He leaned over the keyboard, scanning the digital signatures on each release form. Someone had overwritten safety flags. Someone had forced clearance. "Can you stop the route?" he asked. Dana's face crumpled. "They locked me out. They overrode my authority this morning. I can't change anything until the system resets at 6 a.m. "And that's too late," Caleb said. The realization sat heavy between them. Dana looked at him like the room was tilting. "What do we do now?" Caleb took a slow breath. He saw Mason standing on the overpass years ago, waving at Lena as she drove off. He saw the moment the world broke. He saw the place where the man he used to be had died. "No buses leave that depot tomorrow," he said. "How I stop them myself." It wasn't bravado. It wasn't reckless. It was inevitable. He left the office and moved through the echoing halls, Dana rushing behind him. "Caleb, you'll be arrested. They'll destroy your life." He almost smiled. They've already started. He pushed open the service exit into the cold night. Across the street, the depot glowed with fluorescent light. Mechanics walked in and out. Supervisors checked clipboards. Engines rumbled as warming cycles began. As he watched 2 buses, tall silver, gleaming with fresh paint, were rolled into position for morning departure. Caleb jogged across the street. Dana followed, breath puffing in little clouds. When they reached the fence, he pointed at the rows of idling vehicles. "They won't risk a catastrophe happening on their watch," he said. "They're counting on the system running quietly. Predictably. No disruptions." Dana blinked. So we disrupt it." Caleb circled to the back of the depot, where old maintenance supply trucks were kept. He pulled one open and found exactly what he needed: spare wheel chocks, thick as bricks, heavy enough to stop a bus dead in its tracks. He handed 2 to Dana. "Put these behind the rear axles of every outbound bus. All of them. They won't clear morning checks if they can't roll." She hesitated only a moment before nodding. "What will you do?" Caleb looked toward Bay 12, the heart of the electrical system that powered the automated departure locks. "I'm going to shut down their launch grid." He darted across the lot, moving from shadow to shadow until he reached the bay. He could hear supervisors inside discussing reports, sipping burnt coffee. He climbed onto the exterior maintenance catwalk and dropped down onto a narrow landing beside the control panel. He broke the seal, opened the housing, and with the precision of a man who had once calibrated systems worth billions, he reached into the wiring and disconnected the command module. Every dashboard in the depot flickered, then went dark. Alarms chirped uncertainly. Supervisors yelled. The entire launch grid went offline. In minutes, the place erupted with confusion. Mechanics rushed to consoles. Lights blinked uselessly. Engines sputtered as automated ports locked. And Caleb, dirty, exhausted, labeled a troublemaker, stood in the middle of it all, like a man who had just cut the fuse to a bomb. Dana emerged from behind the line of buses, breathless, the last wheel chock in her hand. "It's done," she said. "Nothing can move." For a moment, the two of them stared at the depot chaos. Then she looked at him with something like awe. "You just saved 1,000 people," she whispered. But Caleb only thought of one, a boy asleep in a small duplex dreaming of science fairs and weekend hikes. A boy who still believed his father was someone worth trusting. The first supervisor spotted Caleb and pointed with wide, furious eyes. There, security surged toward him. But the power dynamic had already changed. He wasn't the man they'd framed. He wasn't the mechanic they'd humiliated. He wasn't the ghost of a tragedy he'd spent years trying to outrun. Tonight, he was something else entirely. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel afraid of what came next. For a moment, the whole depot froze in a kind of stunned paralysis. The overhead lights flickered in uneven pulses, reflecting off rows of immobilized buses that should have been humming with power by now. Instead, the launch grid lay silent, cold, and dead, an entire transit artery severed by one man's decision. Supervisors barked orders that went nowhere. Mechanics stared at monitors that refused to respond. Dispatchers shouted into radios trying to reach each other over a system that had just flatlined. The chaos had a strange, hollow sound to it, like an orchestra tuning up, but discovering all at once that half the instruments were missing. And in the middle of it all stood Caleb, unmoving, his hands lowered at his sides, breathing hard in the cold morning air. Not collapsing, not running, just standing with the calm of a man who had already accepted every consequence that was about to come crashing down on him. Dana reached him first. She stopped beside him, chest rising and falling as if the sprint across the depot had winded her. But her eyes were alive with something that looked like disbelief, mixed with a kind of reverence. "Caleb," she whispered. "I didn't think anyone would have the guts to." "I didn't think I know," he said quietly. "But now everyone's safe. That's what matters." Security was already fanning out across the lot, led by the tall officer from earlier. Ken followed close behind, pointing at Caleb like a prosecutor identifying a murderer. "That's him," Ken shouted. "He sabotaged the launch. Detain him right now." Security officers broke into a run. Dana stepped in front of Caleb without hesitation. "You touch him," she said, her voice slicing through the cold, "and you will answer to me." No one had ever heard the deputy mayor talk like that before. Not the supervisors, not the officers, not the techs staring from the sidelines. The security chief hesitated. "Ma'am, he disabled the entire grid. This is a city emergency." Dana's expression sharpened. "And I'm the one who gave him the intel that proved that sending these buses out today would endanger the public. This man just saved hundreds, maybe thousands of lives. If you think you're arresting him, you're very mistaken." That stopped everyone cold. Mechanics exchanged looks. Supervisors turned pale. For the first time, the weight of what Caleb had done began sinking in. A ripple of awe, moved through the depot. Someone murmured, "He saved the commuter line." Another whispered, "How the hell did he even shut the grid down?" A third said quietly, "You don't do that unless you know exactly what you're doing." The security officers slowed their approach, eyes narrowing, studying the man they'd dismissed as a low-level tech only hours earlier. One officer stepped forward. "Hart, who exactly are you?" Caleb exhaled, and something inside him loosened. He had spent years burying pieces of himself in the dark skills, memories, knowledge too heavy to carry in daylight. But if he didn't speak now, then the story would be written by those who wanted him erased. He looked at Dana. She nodded, giving him silent permission to take back the truth. "I wasn't always a mechanic," he said. The depot grew still. Even the supervisory radio chatter went quiet. "I used to work in federal structural rescue and failure analysis," he continued. "I was part of a task force that handled large-scale collapses, bridges, tunnels, infrastructure at risk. My job was to see the failure before it happened and stop it from taking lives." Ken scoffed loudly. "You expect us to believe that you're a night shift grease monkey?" Caleb didn't raise his voice. "Take it or leave it. But I spent 8 years dangling off the sides of buildings with nothing but a harness and a thermal camera. I spent nights pulling people out of twisted rebar. And I spent too many days explaining to courts why certain disasters were preventable." He paused. "And I lost my wife in one we didn't prevent." The words hit the ground like a dropped tool. Even the wind seemed to stop. Caleb looked past the depot toward the invisible spot on the horizon where the old river bridge had once stood. "I walked away after that," he said. "I took a job fixing buses because it was quiet, predictable, safe for my son. But I still know what a catastrophic failure looks like. And I know when people are manipulating reports to hide the truth." Dana stepped forward. "I verified his credentials this morning," she said to the crowd. "Every word checks out. We have a man here who spent years keeping cities from falling apart, and we treated him like a disposable worker." A murmur rose through the crowd, shame, disbelief, realization all tangled into one uneasy sound. One of the younger mechanics, a kid barely in his 20s, asked softly, "And you're telling us he just saved the downtown express route?" Dana nodded. "Yes. He stopped a failure we were being pushed to ignore." All eyes swung back to Caleb. Ken tried to regain control, stepping forward with manufactured outrage. "Don't listen to this nonsense. He tampered with city infrastructure. His badge was flagged. He was already under investigation." Dana cut him off. "Funny, because the only evidence against him came from the same department that ignored structural warnings, and the same supervisors who told me to stop asking questions." Her gaze fixed on Ken, cold and sharp. "And the same people who said they'd make this problem disappear." Ken opened his mouth, but no words came out. The head of depot operations, a stern woman named Marcy Briggs, pushed her way through the crowd. She'd been silent until now, but she'd seen everything, the shutdown, the panic, the truth forming in front of her. She stood in front of Caleb. "You predicted a system failure before any of us caught it," she said. "You shut it down without harming anyone. And you worked out of spec with nothing but your own knowledge." She folded her arms. "I've been in transit operations for 23 years. I've never seen anything like that." He didn't know what to say. No one had spoken to him like that since before the collapse. Marcy wasn't done. "I should have listened when you flagged those stress fractures last month. You gave us a warning and we brushed you off." A heavy silence followed. Then one of the senior techs spoke up. "We all did. Guy kept telling us these buses weren't passing torque balance tests, and we assumed he was being dramatic." Another voice chimed in. "I thought he was just overcautious because of, his past." Caleb stiffened. He didn't know how many people knew about his wife, or the tragedy that had broken their old life. Dana stepped beside him like a shield. He wasn't overcautious. He was right. And if this city doesn't start listening to people like him, we're going to have more than broken schedules on our hands. We'll have funerals. Supervisors shifted uneasily. Marcy cleared her throat. Hart, I need you to come with me, she said. We're calling an emergency meeting with the Transit Safety Board. They need every detail you have now. Caleb blinked. What they need: your assessment, your analysis, hell, your expertise. She squared her shoulders. And I need to discuss a formal position with you, something far above night shift tech. Ken stepped forward, voice desperate. You can't promote him. He's under investigation. Marcy turned on him. No. You put him under investigation. Conveniently. Suspiciously. And you know what, I want a full inquiry into that too. Ken paled. Dana leaned in close to Caleb. They're seeing you now, she whispered. For who you are, not who you tried to disappear into. But that wasn't the end of the shift. Behind them, the depot radios suddenly lit up in harsh bursts of static. Then a dispatcher's voice broke through, breathless and urgent. We just received word downtown inspectors found a fracture in the East Bank rail connector. Big one. They say it's spreading. Dana's head snapped up. East Bank. That's on the same load-bearing grid as the express line Caleb finished. Everyone went still again, but this time not from shock, from fear. The dispatcher continued, voice shaking. They're asking for an immediate structural specialist to assess collapse risk. Right now, they don't have anyone on site qualified. All eyes turned to Caleb. Dana looked at him with a mix of fear and hope. You're the only one who can do this. Something old and painful knotted in his chest. He thought of Lena. He thought of that bridge. He thought of a promise whispered to a woman he couldn't save. I'll never let this happen again. He straightened. Get me a vehicle, he said. And every set of schematics you have. Marcy spoke into her radio. Emergency transport to East Bank, now. Dana touched his arm. This isn't just about saving a route anymore. This could be the whole district. Caleb nodded. I know. For the first time in years, he wasn't running from who he used to be. He was stepping into it. And the city, waking up to the sound of sirens in the distance, was about to see the man they'd underestimated take command of a disaster that hadn't happened yet. A disaster he intended to stop. They reached the East Bank rail connector just as dawn brushed a thin line of gold across the river. Emergency trucks blocked off the overpass. Workers in reflective jackets clustered around a spiderweb crack running along the steel girder, one that hadn't been there a week ago. Maybe not even yesterday. Caleb slid out of the vehicle before it stopped moving. He didn't wait for permission, didn't ask for forms or protocols. He walked straight toward the fracture, the cold wind snapping at his jacket, and everyone stepped aside without a word. It was the first time in years anyone had treated him like an authority. He crouched beneath the connector and ran his hands along the metal. The vibration told him everything the beam was beginning to separate from its plate, under the weight of early traffic that would shear completely. A chain reaction would follow. It wouldn't take much imagination to see the disaster. He stood slowly and turned to the on-site commander. Shut it down, he said. All of it. This bridge is done for the day. No one argued. Not this time. The order went out instantly, sirens echoing across the river. And as he watched traffic redirect safely away from the site, Caleb felt something he hadn't in years, the quiet satisfaction of preventing tragedy before anyone else even saw it coming. Word traveled faster than the sunrise. Within an hour, the deputy mayor's office arrived, followed by city engineers and reporters kept behind barricades. Dana stayed at Caleb's side through every question, her voice steady, as she explained how his quick action prevented a structural failure during morning commute. Supervisors from the depot arrived too, most of them looking like they wished they could crawl back into their trucks. Ken stayed in the background until it became impossible. Eventually, he approached Caleb with stiff shoulders and a face drained of color. "I didn't know," he said, voice thin. "I didn't know what you'd been through, or what you were capable of. I should have listened." Caleb didn't gloat. He didn't offer comfort either. He just nodded once. It was all the forgiveness Ken was going to get. Marcy Briggs, tough as rebar and twice as unbending, stepped in next. "We'll be conducting a full investigation," she said, "and your suspension is lifted immediately. But that's the small part." She paused, looking him in the eye. "The city needs a chief of structural risk assessment. Someone who sees danger before the rest of us even smell smoke. Someone who can prevent another East Bank." Caleb blinked. "That's a lot of responsibility." Marcy cracked the faintest of smiles. "And you're the only one who's earned it." Beside her, Dana added softly, "This isn't a punishment. It's a way forward. For all of us." For a man who had tried so hard to disappear, being invited into the center of the city's safety efforts felt like stepping into sunlight after living underground. He thought of Mason, of the kind of example he wanted to set, of the kind of father he still hoped to be. He accepted the job. Months passed. Winter settled over Cleveland and melted into spring. The East Bank connector was reforged and reinforced under Caleb's supervision. The depot was overhauled. Oversight protocols changed. Safety meetings became more than box-checking rituals. And people listened to each other, to the warnings buried in the data. Mason adjusted too. He bragged at school that his dad kept the whole city standing, though Caleb gently reminded him that there were teams, big ones, behind every decision. But at home during homework and quiet dinners, something in their life felt steadier, like the fracture that had lived inside their family since Lena's death had at last begun to mend. Dana visited often, always under the pretense of work, though neither of them pressed the boundary too hard. Sometimes they shared coffee and talked about infrastructure failures. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. There was a calmness between them, a mutual understanding built not on crisis, but on clarity. Two people who had spent years speaking quietly in rooms full of noise, finally being heard. As for Ken, he apologized twice more publicly, even. Not everyone gets to see the arc of someone's learning curve, but life has a way of humbling the loudest voices. And the city. Well, the city learned something too. One crisp morning, nearly a year after the shutdown, Caleb and Mason stood on a hill that overlooked the repaired East Bank line. Trains rumbled safely across it, now commuters reading newspapers or sipping coffee, unaware of how close they had come to tragedy. Mason tugged his father's sleeve. "Dad, are you glad you don't hide anymore?" Caleb watched the bridge for a long moment. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think hiding works for a while, until the day it doesn't. And then you remember the kind of person you promised to be." Mason nodded like he understood every word, even if he wouldn't fully grasp it for years. As they walked back to the truck, the early sun cast long shadows across the city bridges. Buildings, roads, structures made strong not because they never cracked, but because someone kept checking for the cracks no one else wanted to see. And in a world that often forgets the quiet people holding it together, it's good to remember this. Sometimes the hero isn't the one shouting orders or standing in the spotlight. Sometimes it's the person who knows exactly where the danger lives and steps into it anyway, simply because someone has to.